I was given this Makita blower by a very good friend of mine, so I was very anxious to get it working again. There's just one issue. I lost a part on the carb, and now I have to make a choice about buying a new carb, but the price you pay for having something so uncommon turns out to be higher than if you had a cheap blower from a popular brand from a big box store. Now I'm beginning to rethink my opinions about getting rare equipment if it means I have to pay more for every part I have to replace. In today's video, we look at this Makita blower, and the problem is that I lost a part on the carb and now I have to consider buying a new carb. The only problem is that the OEM carb is extremely expensive, so I'm considering buying the cheaper aftermarket one, but unfortunately that means I'm also going to get a lower quality part as well. Now, I'm going to try and repair this blower, but yours might be a little different, so this might not work on yours. If things are not working out for you like in the video, please ask about it and I'll be glad to answer your questions. In the previous video, we found our first major issue with it, which was a recoil that didn't catch. After fixing it by installing an OEM swing arm, it seems to work very well. Now, once we were able to turn the engine over, we then tested to see if the engine would even start and run. After confirming that the engine does start and run, we then started to inspect the carb, which is when things went the wrong way. It turns out the metering diaphragm, which controls fuel flow through the carb, was in bad shape and needed to be replaced. I then tried to inspect the pumping diaphragm, and that's when we found out that it was stuck to the main body of the carb. After a short struggle, I was finally able to separate it, but that's when I lost the spring that sits on the pumping diaphragm. Now, after that video was released, I got a lot of great ideas on how to find that spring, and I decided to give it a shot. I then took a magnetic tool holder off the wall and painstakingly worked over an area of 64 square feet, and about the time I was about to give up, I finally found it. Now, I want to thank everybody for a great suggestion about using the magnet. Now, because of the sheer size of the area I was working, I think it took me about 15 minutes to find it. Now, was it worth the effort? And the answer is kind of mixed. Yes, I saved about $15, but the searching was a real pain in the back. Then again, it means we're able to get back to working on the carb instead of waiting, so yes, it was worth it. The next step is to remove the metering diaphragm and make sure I have one on hand that looks like the original one. Now, when taking these off, try to be careful because the least we can do is try to rejuvenate it in the solution we're going to use for the pumping diaphragm. So the diaphragm appears to be a standard 4-bolt with 2 locating tabs, and the stem in the middle is the longer version. Luckily, I do have this one in my tool bag, so we are in luck. So the pumping diaphragm is not in terrible shape, but this part where the spring sits looks to be a bit stiff, so to find out we'll have to take it off. Now try your hardest not to damage it because we intend on reusing it. Now once off the carb, I can feel just how stiff it's become, so I'm going to drop it into our container of rejuvenation fluid for a short time and see if it improves. I wish I could leave it in there for a lot longer, but I don't have the luxury of time. Now try not to get any of this on your hands because it is some terrible stuff. After that, I'll then start to clean the carb using carb cleaner and a wire brush. Now this particular carb isn't all that dirty, but I need to make sure the inlet screen is not clogged and that the main jet is also clear. I've got some time until the minimum amount of time has passed for the diaphragm to soak in the fluid, so not only am I going to clean the carb, but I'm also going to replace the fuel lines. Initially, when I saw the fuel lines, I thought they were in really good condition. However, after taking a closer look, it turns out the clear line is very hard and the rubber line is starting to break down. Unfortunately, this would mean that the owner was putting in ethanol fuel into the tank, which is the worst fuel you can put into small engines. I know the manufacturers say that using E10 or E15 fuel is okay, but I don't agree with them. Now, I don't have a problem using ethanol fuel in small engines, but when the components are exposed to it for a very long period of time, they seem to break down a lot faster. So if I had to use ethanol fuel, I would empty the fuel system each and every time I used it to keep direct contact down to a minimum. I don't expect other people to do the same thing, but remember, when my stuff breaks down, no one is paying me to fix my own stuff, so I don't want that to happen at all. There is one issue though, and that's if I could only get ethanol fuel in my area, I would more than likely find a way to separate that ethanol from the gasoline, which I have to admit is a lot easier than it appears. If you want to find an easy way to remove ethanol from gasoline, simply do a search on this platform and you should find a lot of videos already showing an easy method. After running the return line, it's finally time to connect the fuel lines to the carb. Now the fuel filter line will connect to the barbed port, while the return line will connect to the remaining port. Now once the lines are connected, we can then test for fuel flow through the lines, otherwise the engine is not going to start. So when pressing the bulb, fuel will flow up the filter line and go into the carb, then fill the bulb, and finally leave the carb to return back to the tank through the return line. As you can see, fuel is flowing through the lines just like it's supposed to. If yours is not doing this, then there might be an issue with the carb or fuel lines, and if fuel is coming up through the return line first, then the fuel lines are swapped at the carb. Once we know the fuel is flowing the correct way, we can finally install the carb back onto the engine. Now, if you've opened your carb a couple of times and fuel is still not flowing the right way, I consider replacing the carb with a new one. So is ethanol fuel that bad? And the answer is you betcha. It's so bad I would consider going through the hassle of removing ethanol from pump gas just to avoid having to rebuild or service my carb every other season. Now I only know of one benefit of ethanol fuel, but unless I want to put EFI and forced induction on my lawnmower, I don't think ethanol gasoline and small engines belong in the same sentence. Now I did not order a new air filter, instead I used my degreaser on it and rinsed it clean and then let it dry for a couple of hours. I do plan on replacing the foam pre-filter, but there's a good chance I'll just make one from a bulk piece of foam instead of ordering one. The last thing we need to do is remove the upper bolts for the recoil, and that's because we need to replace the rear cover. The upper bolts are supposed to pass through not only the recoil but also the rear cover. Now, I got a bit excited about starting this blower for the first time, so I did not read the owner's manual to find out the correct starting procedure. Now, starting a 2-stroke blower is fairly common, but when it comes to 4 strokes, the manufacturer may have a very specific way to start it. Now, of course, by now I've obviously read the instructions, so I'll share them with you here in a bit. So it seems to be a bit cold-natured, which is typical of small 4-stroke engines, but once it's at normal temperature, it seems to work really well. Now, according to the owner's manual, when the engine is cold, all we have to do is purge the fuel system, choke the carb, and pull the rope without any throttle input, which is where I messed up, but I still got it started. It would have been a lot worse, though, if the air temperature was a lot colder. Now before I take it on a test drive and the oil is still hot, I want to drain the old oil out and replace it, but after pouring it out, the oil is much worse than I thought. This has to be the original break-in oil, and if it is, I want to remove as much of the dirty oil as possible, so I'm going to flush it. Now, I wouldn't make this a normal procedure when changing your oil. I would only do this when the oil looks this bad and you're not sure when the last oil change was done. I'm going to keep doing this until what comes out of the engine looks like what I put into it and not molasses. Now once I'm certain the engine has been cleaned out, I'm going to leave the blower in the sun and let the flush evaporate. After about an hour, I'll then replace the oil. Now according to the instructions, it takes about 0.08 liters of oil, but even knowing how much the engine needs, I'm still going to recommend checking it with the dipstick. I did have to add oil a couple of times, but eventually I got it over the midway point on the dipstick, which should be fine for right now. Once the oil's been changed, I'm going to take it for a test drive and see how well this blower works. You know what? I really like this blower. It's really quiet at idle, and it's not going to wake up the dead at full throttle either. It's also really easy to use. Sure, it's not the most powerful handheld blower ever, but I think it's worth the trade-off. If I need to move a mountain of leaves, I'm going to use my big backpack blower, but it's much too heavy for everyday use. This one, however, is really enjoyable to use. Another reason why this blower might not be starting is that the valves may need adjusting, which is a serious maintenance issue for all small 4-stroke engines, but on this one you need to check it every 200 hours, which is basically never. Now the oil is supposed to be changed every 50 hours, but it also recommends you change it every 6 months, which is kind of interesting. I would just change it every year and you should be good. So in the end, it only cost us $8 for a new swing arm to fix the recoil and about $5 in fuel lines and the diaphragm to get this blower working again. And as long as you don't drop start the blower, you won't break the recoil, and this high quality blower should stay running for a very long time. So my question is, if your friend dropped off a high-end 4-stroke blower at your house and said, just use it until I come back from my trip around the world, would you use it, or would you keep using your 2-stroke blower instead? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.